All right, section, and we'll start with musical expression creativity. Any questions in there that you guys wanted to talk about? Anything unclear?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't know, you might have already answered it, but as far as the saddest piece ever, we are a musical expression.
Yeah,
Yes?
uh-huh.
Okay. As far as the Adiago for strings, what exactly made it sad? I don't know if we like talked.
Yeah.
I don't know, cause you know how you played that stuff and we were like, oh, we feel like this makes it. Is it all opinionated or is it like personal or?
Right, so that's a good question. What is it about, what about the acoustical properties of this piece reflects sadness? Can anyone answer that?
Minor modes, descending intervals, slow, quiet, and low pitches.
Yeah, so, good, very good. So, a lot of we talked about, so certainly emotion is based on the perception of the listener, right? And there's gonna be some disagreement there. But, we also talked about how acoustic signals are associated with sad speech, and then we looked at the acoustic signals associated with sad music. And in both cases, you've got a slow tempo or more slow delivery, lower overall pitches, smaller pitch movements or smaller intervals, legato articulations, dark timbres, quiet dynamics, and the minor mode. And we talked about how that really reflects a lot of the same acoustic cues of sadness, but there are also sections that are more evocative of grief, which are high arousal states, high pitches, loud, major mode, that sort of thing. So, yep. Any of these others you guys had questions on?
Number 2, like the role of the normative, is that to like give a foundation or?
So, do you remember what, way back, what Eric Clark said about musical creativity? And
It's not easily defined.
it's not easily defined, that's true.
Deviation from the norm.
Deviation from the norm, right? So there's gotta be some sort of baseline standard
Okay.
that's set up that you deviate from in order for it to be creative. And that could be, you know, an even metric grid that you push and pull the tempo on. It could be some like basic tune that you improvise over or something like that. Yeah. Any questions on number 1? It's pretty closely related. The idea of violating norms or expectations somehow. Okay, let's talk about musical performance. Any questions from here that you weren't able to figure out?
I had a question about the first part of number 8. The second part of the first number 8.
Right, okay. What part of the brain is involved in long-term memory formation? That is the hippocampus. Did you get that?
Yes.
And then what are the implications for successfully organizing practice sessions? The hippocampus rehearses what you do during the day as you sleep. And what that means is that the best way of practicing is in small chunks frequently rather than kind of a cram session. Yeah. This is especially true for skill-based things like shooting a basketball or playing B major scale or whatever.
Or F sharp major.
Or F sharp major, yeah. What else? For musical performance.
Number 4.
Oh yeah, naloxone and propranolol. Is that how you pronounce that, nurses? Yeah, propranolol. Propranolol is a beta blocker. So if you're nervous about performing, it's a chemical that you can take that reduces, essentially what it does is reduce the speed of transsynaptic neurotransmitters. Essentially it eliminates the effects of stage fright. Naloxone, on the other hand, is, we didn't really talk about that. We're going to talk about that when we talk about neurochemistry. So I probably won't ask you that on the test. But naloxone, what it does is it's an opioid receptor blocker. So it keeps you from experiencing pleasure. So people that take naloxone and then it's used a lot actually in overdoses for opioids, and it kind of brings you back. But if you take naloxone, you will pretty much lose all interest in eating. Eating will be a dry mechanical process, and music listening also becomes unenjoyable.
Number 13?
13, how do performers clarify musical structure? Yeah, so there were 3 different ways that we talked about clarifying musical structure in terms of lengthening. So there's agogic lengthening, pause lengthening, and foot lengthening. So agogic lengthening is essentially it puts stress on certain notes, or if you're speaking syllables. Pause lengthening, what you do is you emphasize something by putting a pause after it, showing where there's a structural boundary. And then foot lengthening is where you do both, where you stress it and then, stress certain syllables and then pause afterwards.
How do you spell the first word?
Agogic, A-G-O-G-I-C.
Okay.
And then there were 2 other things that we talked about related to animacy cues, actually. So you can clarify the musical structure where things begin and end based on how you handle the beginnings and ends of those things. So typically you're going to slow down at the ends of a phrase or a boundary and then speed up at the beginning. Kind of like, if you remember, throwing a ball up in the air, kind of pauses and then comes back down, speeds back up.
Number 14?
14, how are timing and loudness related? They're linked. So that increasing in loudness tends to lead to faster playing. I teach piano lessons to little kiddos, 7, 8, whatever. And this is a problem. Actually, it's a big problem. I tell them, okay, it's a quiet moment, play quietly. And they slow way the heck down. I'm like, no. Same speed, just, so it's a natural tendency that we have, and we bring that to the surface when we perform. So generally speaking, when we pull back in dynamic, we also pull back in timing, slow things down. You guys remember what proofreader's error is? Can someone sum that up for me?
You assume it's correct. Like, your brain doesn't quite recognize that it's incorrect. It sees what is correct.
Yeah. You correct mistakes, essentially, right? It's the reason why you can have 2 thes back to back in a paper that you submit for a grade, even if you've read it like 15 times, right? Because you miss it. You just get rid of one of the thes. What is rubato again?
It's like taking your time within music and never losing the tempo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's essentially a stretching, a pushing and pulling of the tempo. So you take your time, you slow things out, or you speed through something. And why is that important to musical and expressive performance?
Gives some uniqueness and variability. Something to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Also, animacy cues, right? Things that are alive will respond in non-Newtonian ways, right? Music that's played with rubato facilitates more empathetic listening. So playing with rubato involves the production of jerk motion, things that aren't explainable by Newtonian mechanics, which is interpreted by the brain as an animacy cue. In other words, that the music is alive, right? So non-mechanical timing causes the brain to judge the sound as originating with an animate agent rather than an inanimate object. And as a result, rubato tends to bring the music alive. So if you play the music without rubato at all, if it's completely and totally strict metrically, then it sounds very unalive. It sounds very mechanical. Any other questions on musical performance? Music philosophy. All right, music philosophy.
Number 1.
What is music? What is music, guys?
I don't.
You don't know?
Apparently.
I just wrote construct of human mind.
Yeah, that's not bad. Yep, it is a construct of human mind. Good. Yeah, does music exist objectively?
Define objectively.
Objectively, without any observer around.
Yes.
Is that like a tree falling in the forest?
Yeah, it's exactly like a tree falling in the forest.
Because you can have a music box playing without anybody there.
But is it music then?
Yes.
It's
It's a
certainly.
music box, so it's music.
So therefore, so what we talked, if you remember, we read an article called "Why Music Theory is a Figment of the Imagination" on the non-existence of music, and it made the claim that music doesn't objectively exist in reality, but it only exists as we perceive it as music, right? So, in other words, what's the difference between the sound of a jackhammer and a Beethoven symphony? I mean, they're all sound waves, right? So what makes one set of sound waves music and the others not? And it's really how we perceive it, right? And when we talked about the boundaries between what's music and what's not music, we talked about how even what we consider non-musical sounds can be used in musical ways, right? You could put a jackhammer as a rhythm part. You know, you could sample it and use it in a hip hop track, right? Is it music then? Well, maybe it is, right? So it really is kind of a it's in the mind of the listener, but it's also reflected in, so the way that manifests itself. It's reflected in musical scores, right? So that we call that music. Piece of paper with notation on there, instructions on how to perform. Audio signals generated by a performance we can call music. Physical CDs or MP3 files. You know, look at my music collection. The effect of performances on scores on listeners. So as I listen to something, there's music sort of happening in my brain, right, that I'm experiencing, and then it's also compositional ideas in a specific work. So music sort of as it exists in the mind of the composer before it's notated. All of these things we can call music, but all of them are dependent really on the mind of the listener. Okay, that's music. What other questions here? I'm happy to. So even if it's a question that you feel like you've answered, I'm happy to talk about it too. So don't hesitate to ask about any of these.
Number 6.
6 is music theory scientific theory. What do you think?
I want to say yes, but then I want to say no.
So what is this? Yeah, right.
Hurts my brain.
No is the answer. It's not. And this is
Aha.
talked about again in that article on the non-existence of music. So if you want to go back and review that. Essentially, music theory is a collection of rules which describe culturally determined practices, whereas a scientific theory is a proposition claiming to explain aspects of the world. And these claims are subject to testing and falsification by contrary evidence. And that's not really true of music theory. So in the scientific sense, music theory isn't really a scientific theory. Yeah. You guys remember what the semantic gap is?
Isn't that the part that can't be removed from music? Like we can only explain so much.
Yeah,
And then
we
there's
can
that little gap.
we can objectively count and measure all sorts of things about musical information just by looking at, say, an audio signal. But there are things that people experience about music that we can't ever quite fully explain just by doing that. And so the gap between what we're able to explain by objective measurement and what people experience is called the semantic gap. In other words, musical information that listeners hear and perceive which stubbornly refuses to be extracted from audio signals in isolation. A good example of this would be timbre, which is why you guys did that experiment, right? Because timbre is something that's hard to get at objectively. Can music exist without any audio signals? How? Memory? Yeah. So if I ask you to think of your current favorite song, could you hit the play button in your mind? Yeah. How else?
There's music can be found in silence because music is more than just vibrations. It's also silence as well.
Well, that's very deep. Yeah, I wasn't thinking along those lines. Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, without silence, you can't have music. Some way,
There's
some
that
sense.
song completely made up of res.
Right.
Is it like 33? 4?
Yeah. Yeah. Although his point there is that the other sounds that you hear, the non-scripted sounds, are musical. You can think of them as musical. But yeah, no, I understand. Yeah. Also, I think if I give a trained musician a score, they can look at the score and imagine what it sounds like. So no audio signals there too. So yeah, there's several ways in which we can. If I ask you, how does Happy Birthday go? You could probably do that in your head without, Okay. You guys good on musical philosophy? Any other questions? Okay, auditory anatomy and physiology. Don't forget that for sure I'm gonna give you a piece of the ear, a diagram of either the outer, inner, or middle ear, and ask you, and it'll be unlabeled, but it'll have pieces identified and you'll have to provide the labels. So make sure that you're comfortable with doing that. You guys all know where those are? It was like week 3 or something, week 2 or week 3. It was the ear for music. It was the ear, so it's just the Okay, what else? Do you know what human-generated sound the ear is most sensitive to? Screaming, yeah. And where's the energy? What frequency? 3 to 5,000 hertz. Yeah, 2 to 5,000 hertz, somewhere in there. You get right around 3,500 hertz is where the most energy is.
Baby's crying.
Baby's crying as well. Yep, same exact range. And also, what else? Opera singers. Yeah, opera singers control the inner workings of their voice to generate maximum energy at the same area. What's tonotopic mapping? What does it mean? What does tonotopic mapping mean?
Isn't that the mapping of where the frequencies hit on the ear cochlea?
Yeah.
Or whatever it's called.
Yeah. So tono is pitch, right? And topic is place. So it's like a pitch place hearing theory, and it's the idea that we can map the frequency of the pitch along the basilar membrane. So there are particular places along the basilar membrane, which is that membrane in the cochlea. If you just stretch it out, it's about 30 millimeters long. And specific places will maximally vibrate at various frequencies. And then we can also map that to neural activity in response. This is closely related to question 6, the place theory of hearing, which suggests that the perception of pitch is related to the point of maximum excitation on the basilar membrane. High and low frequencies will excite the basilar membrane at opposite ends of the cochlea, with intermediate frequencies exciting the middle section of the membrane. There's a direct mapping between the input frequency and the place of maximum excitation, hence the so-called place theory. The mapping of frequency to neural activity along the membrane is said to be a tonotopic mapping. That's kind of what we just said.
Do we have to spell all of these things correctly?
No, as long as I can, yeah, as long as I can get an idea of what you meant.
Okay.
It's got to be close enough for me to understand.
I guarantee it's not gonna be right.
Okay, fine. Which part of the basilar membrane has the most activity for low frequency inputs?
part, the place farthest away from the entry point.
Yeah, technical term is the apex, because lower pitches have longer wavelengths. It'll excite further down the basomembrane. Okay, make sure that you are comfortable with masking skirts. I think that I want to put a masking skirts question on the test. Can't promise you. I haven't finished writing the test yet, but I think I'm going to put a masking skirts question on it. So make sure that you're comfortable diagramming masking skirts. And specifically how masking skirts show masking from various complex pitches. Yeah, there you go. Highlight that bad boy. Any other questions in this section? You guys all feel pretty confident about auditory anatomy and physiology? Okay. Acoustics and sensation.
Number 6.
What is meant by spectral content? Can anyone answer that question? What's the spectrum?
I said the fundamental and the partials that make up a complex tone.
Yeah, that's good. I like that definition. The spectrum is sort of the range of human hearing, right? Or the range of a complex sound. Another way of putting what Jess so eloquently put would be the recipe of harmonics that make up a complex tone. Sort of, essentially, spectral content is usually characterized by figuring out where the frequency of each partial is, and then how much strength or average amplitude of each partial, right? So it's sort of which partials are there, followed by what strength they are. If you remember, there was like a diagram of lines like this. Each line was at a different spectral, at a different frequency, and then this measured the amplitude, right? And what is spectral roll-off?
It's like with the amplitude and the frequency, as it gets higher, it doesn't have to be as loud to be as piercing.
Yeah, sure. So spectral roll-off is in a complex pitch, the higher frequency partials tend to have less energy in them. So most pitches that are complex, including the voice and almost every pitch you're ever going to hear, more energy is at the bottom towards the fundamental than in the higher overtones. Okay, what else here?
Number 14.
14. Pratt. Oh yeah. Pratt 1930. You guys remember what experiment that was?
What's the one? Oh, there's 2 13s.
Oh, the 2 13s. Oh, the azimuth
Yeah.
question? Yeah. I don't know how this happened. Couple 13s here. Okay, so azimuth. Yeah, is azimuth learned or innate? You guys know? Well, first of all, what is azimuth?
A horizontal pitch location.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's how we localize where a sound is coming from along the horizontal dimension. And is that learned or innate? It's innate, right? You remember that experiment where, so Hoffman, 2002, put earplugs in people's ears that blocked all the sound, but then there were microphones and speakers, and then they rerouted the sound to other places, and they had people go about their business for a few weeks. And then they came back and they played sounds for people, and they were completely off about where they were coming from. So it appears that that's innate. This is contrasted, of course, with elevation. Is elevation learned or innate? Learned, right? Elevation is learned. And the reason for that seems to be because our ears are constantly changing, right? As we get older, our ears are changing shape. And so elevation is controlled by how sounds bounce around in our concha, which is this part in the middle here before it goes into our ear. And higher elevation things will be filtered by the way that our concha is shaped to reflect higher energy in the upper partials, where lower sounds in elevation will reflect lower energy. So in some sense, we can actually tell how high elevation things are based on the timbre of the sound. And because our ears are constantly changing, the way that they filter is constantly changing. And Hoffman did a study in 1998. This is question, was it 15? Yeah, where they did something similar but with plastic molds that changed the shape of the concha. And listeners were completely unable to figure out where the elevation of things were. But then after wearing them for a few weeks and coming back, they had completely adapted. So they appear to be learned. How do we figure out where azimuth is, by the way? Where sounds come from in azimuth? So if a sound comes from over here, how do I know that it's coming from over here?
Because there's more coming from that direction than there is from this side.
Yeah, first of all, it's going to be louder, right? And second of all, it's the interaural time difference. Sound will come, because sound doesn't travel through the air, it'll come into this ear first before it comes into this ear. And so the time difference, the delay, will tell me how much more close the sound is to this ear than that ear. So, okay, what else?
What was the first number 13?
Pratt?
The most common cultural metaphor.
Oh, the common yeah, the first 13, right? The most common is height, right? So we talk about high and low pitches, but the second is size. So some cultures talk about low tones as being big and high tones as small, and this is directly related to the size of a resonator, right? The bigger the resonator, the lower the pitch in general. Blind people, I think I mentioned this in class too. Blind people tend to refer to low sounds as big and high sounds as small as well. People that have been congenitally blind from birth, although they oftentimes will learn the terminology of whatever culture they're in. Anything else here? You guys are all good about orienting responses, the difference between overtones, harmonics, and partials. What an auditory evoked potential is. Okay, cool. Moving on, psychoacoustics. Got a lot of these.
Number 5.
Number 5, singer's formant. Yeah, okay, so this is closely related to the sound that we are most sensitive to, the human scream. So the singer's formant is the tendency of singers to put the majority of the upper partial energy into the region of maximum sensitivity of hearing. And the idea here is that they have to sing over a giant orchestra, so they're going to put the most energy in the place that the ear is most sensitive to, so they can be heard over 100, orchestral instruments.
Putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, there you go. Look at how much you guys learned, by the way. I'm really impressed at how many of these you guys feel like you're comfortable with. It's crazy, like, how much we've covered in, 2 months, really. What else? You guys know what resonance is? What's resonance?
Anyone? This is
Oh.
what we did on the piano, right?
Yeah, Can you describe that?
No.
It's like I know what it is, I just have no idea how to explain it.
Yeah. Okay, so resonance is every physical object has a specific frequency or a number of frequencies that it sympathetically vibrates to, sort of a natural resonance. And if you sing at that pitch, then the string will start vibrating, right? If it's a string. I mean, if it's a table, this table probably has a really low resonance because it's a pretty big object. And if you remember that bridge that started wobbling like this that we looked at, the wind was hitting the resonance of that bridge, and that the bridge ended up collapsing. So it's essentially the frequency or frequencies at which a body vibrates. And if a sound matches the body's resonance, the body will sympathetically vibrate. Which is why my voice could be echoed back at me from the piano, because all of the frequencies that are all of the sine waves that are made up in my voice have corresponding piano strings, right? And so the energy at the various frequencies, the spectral content of my voice, was reflected back at me because of the sympathetic vibration of the strings in the piano. What's the difference between auditory and acoustic phenomena? What is an auditory phenomenon?
Like measurable and or not measurable, is that the big thing?
So acoustic is measurable. Acoustic is something measurable in the world, right? I can measure how much air is being pushed, right? The amplitude of a sound. Loudness would be a subjective mental phenomenon. So auditory phenomena are subjective, mental. Acoustical are objective and physical. Is it the auditory system's goal to give us an accurate picture of the world? What is its goal?
Give us a helpful one.
Give us a helpful one. Help us survive and thrive. Yeah. Do you guys remember what streaming is, or auditory scene analysis? Number 7, what is auditory scene analysis?
We talked about
Isn't that like when you hear sounds and it like puts pieces in, I don't know how to explain it, I can think it in my head. But like when you hear things, you're making a scene essentially in your head of what's around you and what's making sounds at you.
Yeah, that's well described. Good.
like
Other,
echolocation.
pardon?
Like echolocation.
Yeah, so we are using sounds to figure out not only what things are, but where they are. Yep. A technical description would be parsing auditory information into auditory images or objects. So instead of hearing a whole bunch of frequencies at various strengths, what I hear is a cat meowing, or someone scooting in their chair, or someone writing on a page, right? So what I'm doing, my brain is packaging a bunch of partials together into auditory objects. That's what auditory scene analysis is. And this is aided by 5 things: toneness, harmonicity, partials being from the same location, pitch co-modulation, and onset synchrony. Those things all, if frequencies are starting at the same time and ending at the same time, I'm more likely to hear them as part of the same auditory object. What did Albert Bregman discover? You guys remember that? That was the first research article we read. Question number 8. Albert Bregman discovered that people can't listen to 2 auditory streams at once. Quick alternations between pitches far enough apart will prevent people from hearing one stream. So we break the auditory scene into 2 different streams. You guys know what auditory streams are?
I feel like I might have an idea, like a mental image, but
So Naomi just created an auditory stream by answering my question. There were a whole bunch of sounds in her answer that she generated with her mouth and her vocal cords and all that. And I heard all of that as one thing, Naomi's answer. So an auditory stream is taking discrete things and tying them together into the same auditory object, right? The dripping of a faucet, if it's fast enough, I'm going to hear it as one auditory stream. How how does echoic memory, this is question 6, how does echoic memory relate to melody perception, which is closely related to auditory streaming? What is echoic memory first?
The memory of melody.
It's a little bit less musical than that. It's the after image of a sound. So your brain actually continues to respond to a sound even after it stops. And this is relevant for melody because echoic memory helps listeners assemble different sounds into the same auditory stream. And if you actually look at how melodies are constructed, so echoic memory has a half-life of about 1 second. So after 1 second, the pitch is about half as vivid as it is while you're hearing it. And if you look at the way melodies are constructed, it's rare for a single melody, which is intended to be heard as a single stream, to have pauses of more than 1 second, which enables the perception of melody, which is tied, tying all these discrete pitches into one thing, one stream. What's the trill threshold? So you aren't as confident with all these as you let on. What is the trill threshold?
I know where I can find it.
So when it's time to go study, you're gonna go find it. Yeah, the trill threshold is the distance between pitches at which, no matter how fast or how slow you play them, they're always gonna fuse into one stream, and it's about 15% of the fundamental of one pitch. So if I've got two pitches that are about a minor third or less apart, then no matter how fast you play them, you're always going to hear them as one stream. Bigger intervals, if you go really fast, they're going to split into two streams. If you go slow, then you're going to hear them as one stream. But the further apart you get, the less likely you are to hear them as one stream. And so at some point, they're going to be so far apart that no matter how slowly you play them, they're still going to be heard as two separate streams. And that's called the yodel boundary. So it's 10 and 11. Do you guys remember what Fletcher-Munson curves are?
Just the loudness contours for human ear, but I didn't know what else,
Yeah,
like how to elaborate on
that's
that.
exactly right. Yeah, you might have a hard time understanding what that means. The idea is that there are a lot of things that go into how loud we hear a sound, and one of those things is frequency. So there are certain areas in which our ear is more sensitive to sound than others. We've already talked about that. It's between 2,000 and 5,000 hertz, specifically right around 3,500 hertz. And if you look at the Fletcher-Munson curve, it looks something like this. Do I have a marker here? I don't think I do. It looks something like this, where it dips down, and then there's a dip right at 3,500, and then it goes back up. And essentially, what this curve is regardless. So the x-axis is frequency, and the y-axis is loudness. So in other words, if I'm going to take a low pitch and I want it to sound as loud as a high pitch, I have to play it with a lot more amplitude because I'm not very sensitive to pitches in that range. And so it's a curve that shows the area of similar loudness regardless of frequency. In other words, frequency influences how loud we hear something. And this is kind of the answer to number 14. 6 factors that influence how loud we hear things. Amplitude. Yeah, I'd give you more than 6. Amplitude, frequency, timbre, duration, the presence of other sounds, memory, time of day, familiarity, expectation, your attitude, and the intermittency of the sounds. Which one is the most important, though? What's the most important acoustic feature that influences perceptions of loudness?
Frequency? Amplitude.
Amplitude, yep. What's irritating about hearing masking?
Means that you're not getting all the information.
Yeah, we're not able, we know that there's information in the environment that we're not able to hear. And that is related to dissonance, right? What is dissonance again? Can someone define that for me?
Inharmonious sound?
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's combinations of pitches that are perceived as relatively inharmonious, rough, or unpleasing. And what influences dissonance?
Masking?
Masking is a big one, right? So masking specifically, how far apart on the critical, how far apart in critical bands are two pitches that are maximally dissonant?
40%.
40% of a critical band. How long is a critical band?
10 millimeters?
1 millimeter.
Okay.
Yep. So the basilar membrane is 30 millimeters long, and there are two pitches that are 1 millimeter apart is going to be about one critical band. So in other words, there won't be any masking at all if you're about 1 millimeter apart. And if you're 40, I guess that'd be 4/10 of a millimeter apart, then there's maximal masking, and that influences dissonance. Other things that influence dissonance, loudness. So if you want to make something less dissonant, you can play it quieter. Absolute pitch height, the higher the pitch, the less dissonant. So if you want something to be less dissonant, you can play it higher. And the reason for that is because the upper partials, there will be fewer of them that are in the range of human hearing. And the upper partials, the higher upper partials, are the ones that usually create the most dissonance. The tuning that you're used, the more just the intonation, the less dissonance. Timbre, culture, right? So things you're familiar with are less dissonant. Whether or not you're a musician, gender, even, all these things play a role in dissonance. Okay, number 19. Critical bands are known to relate to distances along the basilar membrane. In millimeters, what's the approximate size of a critical band? 1 millimeter, again. Describe how it's possible to hear a missing fundamental pitch.
Our brain fills in the holes.
Our brain fills in the holes, yeah. It's well put. We hear a package of partials that are harmonic of a fundamental frequency. Even if the frequency isn't actually there, we still hear it because our brain thinks there must be a fundamental there that's being masked or something like that, or that I'm just not hearing. You guys feel comfortable about shepherd's tones? How they're built and what do they demonstrate?
You want to explain it for us so we can be
Sure,
100%?
yeah. Shepherd's tones are complex tones constructed using octave-spaced partials, which is unique, that span the range of hearing. They also have the most energy in the middle of the range of hearing, and then they trail off. And using these tones, Shepard was able to construct tone sequences which were completely intransitive with respect to pitch. In other words, Shepard was able to construct tone sequences such that tone A was perceived as higher in pitch than tone B higher than C, but tone C was perceived as higher than A. And that phenomenon led to the discovery that what we call pitch actually consists of two independent sorts of perception, pitch height and pitch chroma. And how could a performer reduce the sensory dissonance? We already talked about these, but degree of dissonance can be reduced by transposing the work up in pitch, such as up an octave, for example. Reducing the dissonance, you can also employ more muted timbres, which has less energy in the upper partials. You can also play it quieter. All these things will influence that. Any other questions in this section? There's a lot in there in psychoacoustics. Jess? No. Okay. What are musical psychoacoustics? I guess let's ask specific questions here. So 1 through 7. Any questions in here? what's tonal fusion, by the way?
Isn't when they become the same pitch? Is it?
So tonal fusion is where we hear two complex pitches that we have a hard time telling are two complex pitches. Our brain tends to bundle them together into one single tone. And this happens with harmonicity. So if we have a package of partials, that's one pitch, and a package of partials, that's another pitch. And the second pitch is harmonically related to the first, such that most of the overtones here are also overtones of the first pitch. Then we tend to think of them as, we can hear them as one pitch. They tend to fuse in our brains. This is related to consonants, but it's not the same thing, because consonants could be thought of as the pleasingness of the sound, whereas it's not always the same thing as harmonic fusion.
How are tonal fusion and streaming? They seem similar to me. Are they drastically different?
So we're going to tend to, so if two pitches will fuse together, then we're unaware that there are two pitches there. So if we want to, so for example, if you're thinking about voice leading, parallel perfect octaves are bad for maintaining the independence of the vocal parts, because parallel perfect octaves, this octave will tend to fuse in one pitch, and this octave will tend to fuse in one pitch, and so it's hard for us to stream two separate streams. If we have something, this is exactly the reason why parallel octave sounds bad.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's hard to stream things that fuse together in two separate streams, in other words. Okay, what's the difference between tonic and phasic arousal again?
Tonic is long term and phasic is more quick,
Yep.
more transient.
Tonic arousal, relatively slow changes to base level arousal. Phasic is usually stimulus induced, such as like the barking of a dog, for example. Okay, two tones begin precisely in tune. One of them is gradually tuned away. What happens? Well, the two tones begin in unison, with the result that the tones fuse together and are perceived as a single tone, rather than as two distinct tones. As the tones drift apart, there arises a slow beating, which gradually becomes faster. Nevertheless, the two tones remain fused and are perceived as a single tone whose frequency lies midway between the two physical tones. As the rate of beating increases, the beating gives way to a sensation of roughness, and there's a border region which it's ambiguous whether there are one or two tones present, and as the tones continue to move apart, the roughness disappears, and we hear two distinct tones, one of static pitch and the other one moving. A very detailed phenomenological account of that phenomenon. What's the deal with the order of consonants for various harmonic intervals? Why did the experiments in the 19th and 20th century not show consistent rankings of orders of intervals?
Is it related to their relationship in the basilar membrane? Is that it?
True. Yep. So the octave that the intervals are played at influences that, right? Because lower octaves, they're closer to one basilar membrane and one critical band, and higher octaves, they're. But it's also influenced by things like timbre, loudness, and tessitura, all relating to dissonance. And these things weren't really controlled. Okay, moving on. Musical illusions. Any questions here?
Tone language? Three?
What's a tone language? A language with different tones that influence the meaning of a word. So how I pronounce a word influences how I perceive it, what the meaning is. So car or car all have different meanings. tone language, although I don't think it's car, it's something else. How does learning a tone language influence absolute pitch?
If you learn a language that's dependent on the specific pitch that you hit, you'll hit it every time because you've got the pitch memorized.
And as a result, people from that culture will have a greater prevalence of having absolute pitch than people in non-tone language cultures. Abraham suggested that absolute pitch is innate to all listeners starting off and that children gradually unlearn it as they grow up. How and why would we unlearn absolute pitch?
We don't need it as much.
Yeah, we don't need it as much. We unlearn absolute pitch because we practice singing songs in different keys. Or speech is, it doesn't matter what level tone I speak it at, it means the same thing. So we learn that absolute pitch is not the best strategy for recognizing similarity in music, rather relative pitches. And so we sort of uncode for that. What's the common error that's made by musicians possessing perfect pitch? And what does that show us? If you remember, I had two graphs where we had non-perfect pitch people and perfect pitch people, and it showed the right answer plus the scattering of wrong answers for the non-perfect pitch people. And generally speaking, as the pitch got higher, their guess got higher, but there's kind of a cloud around the right answer. Perfect pitch people, as the pitch got higher, their guess got higher. There wasn't a cloud around the right answer, but rather there were two lines that were less significant, kind of going along with the right answer. And that showed that perfect pitch people were getting chroma right, but guessing at the octave. Any other questions here? 8 is kind of interesting. How does auditory streaming influence the chromatic scale illusion of the glissando illusion? Well, if you remember, auditory streaming is the tendency for our brains to connect the dots between discrete stimuli by latching onto auditory streams. And that makes us hear notes connected to each other, even if they change the location where they're coming from. So in other words, streaming can change the apparent location of the sounds. If you remember, the glissando illusion switched, a single tone, D, 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 with a do, right? It kept going back and forth. But we heard the glissandos coming from one side, and the constant pitch is coming from the other, kind of throughout. Okay, I probably have to pick up the pace a little bit. Commercial music. How do retailers use music to accomplish their goals? Well, they can increase actual crowding without increasing the perception of crowding by using music to mask other noises. What's the goal of Muzak for work areas?
To increase productivity.
Increase productivity. And it does this by maintaining arousal without attracting attention. Number 2, what makes background music effective? 5 things. Cover a wide range of frequencies, especially in the speech range, fairly continuous sound, little dynamic range, short silences between songs or no silences between songs, and an even distribution of sound. When is an introvert's acrophase? Morning. Introverts typically have acrophase in the morning, extroverts in the evening. Okay, what is an arousing sound? A sound that's loud, physically close, approaching, fast tempo, unexpected, with learned associations with danger or opportunity, sounds that are addressed to us, or sounds that are indicative of motion. They're going to grab our attention. Sorry, they're going to raise arousal levels. What are Burris, Meyer, and Cardinal curves?
Those were when the productivity increased and decreased throughout the day.
That's when productivity increased and decreased throughout the day. And the lowest productivity happened when?
After
2
lunch.
p.m.
After lunch, around 2 p.m. and mid-morning. This is the birth of the coffee break. Okay, what's the Hawthorne effect?
Whenever you change something, it'll increase productivity just for a second, just because you're changing something.
Mm-hmm, that's right. What's the Yerkes-Dodson law? What's the optimum arousal level for a task?
Depends on the task.
Depends on the task, right? So the more complex the task is, then the lower the arousal should be. The more simple the task is, the higher the arousal. Any other questions in this section? Okay, emotion. What is emotion, according to Sylvan Tompkins?
We defined it many times.
Yes?
Motivational amplifier.
Yeah, motivational amplifier, or compelling subjective feelings that motivate an individual to behave in ways that are normally adaptive or beneficial. Motivational amplifiers for short. Okay, what emotions can music reliably communicate according to Useline?
The basic emotions?
They're just 5. Yeah, the basic emotions: happy, anger, sadness, fear, and then tenderness too, which isn't a basic emotion. And disgust is a basic emotion, but that's not on the list. Okay, what did Hefner in 1936 discover about how music communicates emotion? Hefner found that different musical parameters were more or less suited to expressing particular emotions. So she did this by systematically manipulating various musical parameters like pitch height, mode, melodic direction, and specifically she found that the minor mode communicates sadness or seriousness. Do you remember Paul Ekman's work? The idea of basic emotions is that there are only a small number of basic emotions, that all of the more complex emotions are just combinations of. There's also a dimensional model of emotions, which puts all of emotions in like a 2-dimensional space, arousal and valence, and Hefner's adjective circle relates to that dimensional model. You can see her adjectives kind of along those 2 dimensions. Okay, what does it mean that emotions are adaptive?
They help us to confront a problem.
Yeah, they're good for us. They help us confront a problem, or they encourage us to behave in ways that are good for us, or discourage us from behaving in ways that are bad for us. We've already talked about sad speech and music cues. Huron, Newman, Chordia, they creatively researched the effect of pitch height on perceived sadness while avoiding culturally learned connotations by using a brand new scale. And if you remember, there was an exposure phase where they trained people to listen to what is normal, and then they had lower than normal to find that it was sadder. Is itchiness an emotion?
Yes,
Why?
because it prompts us to change something.
Yeah, right. It amplifies our motivation for scratching, which is beneficial for us, which removes pests or mud or whatever. Okay, how does misattribution work? Misattribution is the phenomenon of attributing an emotion to a cause other than the cause which evoked the emotion. So Dutton and Aaron did the Meet You at the Capilano Canyon experiment where they had people walk across the swaying bridge and they thought they were in love, right, with the beautiful lady on the other end. And it's very possible that emotions evoked by music are commonly misattributed to associated people or places. Okay, what are Huron's 5 emotional systems related to expectation? It's imagination, tension, prediction, response, and appraisal. Imagination. So describe imagination response. Emotions evoked by imagining some outcome. For example, by imagining the embarrassment of telling your boss that you haven't completed an important project, you might decide to work late. The imaginative response is thought to be the basis for deferred gratification. The tension response, feelings of tension arise before an anticipated event. The feelings arise from changes in arousal and attention, such as changes of muscular tension and vigilance. Prediction response is a positive or negative feeling that's evoked immediately following some event. If you're right, you get this positive feeling. If you're wrong, you get a negative feeling. The reactive response, it's an evoked emotion that occurs immediately following some outcome. Reactive responses are kind of quick and dirty judgments based on whether or not something seems beneficial or detrimental. So an example of a reactive response would be if someone slams the door, you're gonna startle, right? The appraisal response is a positive or negative response that's evoked after careful consideration of some outcome. Appraisal responses involve conscious thought about some event. So an example would be if someone slams the door, you might react strongly first, but then you might appraise and think, oh, it's probably just the wind, right? Okay, what's contrastive valence?
Feeling good is better after feeling bad.
Bingo, yeah. The positive or negative feelings that you experience are stronger if you experience the contrasting feeling right before it. What good is feeling bad? How does that serve us? It discourages behavior that led to bad feelings. Okay, social emotions, shame, jealousy, pride, suspicion, hatred, love, anything that connects with other people. What hormone, do you guys remember what hormone is associated with forming of strong memories related to music?
Not oxytocin, is it?
It is oxytocin. It is oxytocin, which is released in both traumatic and ecstatic situations. Oxytocin tends to erase existing memories and help encode new memories. And what's the theory of plural pleasures?
Like with eating, or you can feed to multiple pleasures. You can feed to your auditory, your olfactory, your sensory, your visual, your all these different
Social,
pleasures.
yeah, all these things. Yeah, so it's the tendency to multiply how many pleasures we experience at once in different ways. Okay, perceived and induced emotion. Perceived is the emotion we think is being expressed, regardless of whether we feel that way. Induced emotion is what we feel, regardless of whether we think the emotion is being expressed. 5 theories, according to Usleen, of how music induces emotion: musical expectancy, mood contagion, non-musical associations, mental imagery, and arousal potential. What are acoustic properties of sexy sounds?
They're close. They're wet. Low timbre.
Yeah, they're close to us. Early reflections, so they're oral wetness cues. We can hear smiling voice. They tend to be more breathy, and they tend to be higher or quiet voice, and also auditory cuteness often is involved. Mirror neurons are cool. What do? Neurons that normally fire when we experience something, that also fire when we watch someone else experiencing that thing. And that's related to, thanks. That's thought to relate to empathy. It's also thought to relate to how we get induced to experience emotions that other people are experiencing. Okay, what did Strack discover about how we can induce emotional states using only a pen? If I alter someone's physiological state, that can lead to changes in their emotion. So what he did was he had people put the pen in their mouth without touching their lips, simulating smiling, and they thought the comics were funnier. If he had the pen in the mouth without it touching their lips, it simulated frowning, and people thought the comics were sadder, or not as funny. Yeah, not sad necessarily. Okay, we've already talked about NMCQs. What is the ethological model, acoustic ethological model? This is that 4x4 grid. It's 2x2 grid. High-pitched sounds that are loud communicate what? Fear and alarm. High-pitched sounds that are quiet are submissive or friendly. Low, loud sounds are aggressive or threat. And low, quiet sounds are sad or sleepy. Okay, what's a signal? What are 5 characteristic properties of a signal?
Signal is visual. It's intended to change response in others.
Good. It's communicative and purposeful and intended to change the response of others. They typically tend to be multimodal, employ purpose-specific anatomical elements, they influence other behaviors, intraspecies rather than interspecies, and obvious rather than subtle. Cues tend to be unimodal, don't involve purpose-specific anatomy. They're learned from experience rather than innate. They are features. They're artifacts of other behaviors. They're not solely used for the cue, and they tend to be more subtle than obvious. So how is crying like a signal? Watery eyes, nasal congestion, contraction in the throat, erratic breathing, puffy face. All these are indicative of multimodal signals that are supposed to be obvious. And they change other people's behaviors, right? They lower testosterone levels and call off the attack. Okay, musical development. 3 general classes of behavior that can be observed by psychologists. Someone?
Gross, metabolic, and verbal.
Gross, metabolic, and verbal. Yeah, one example of each. Toe tapping would be gross. Heart rate, metabolic. Self-report would be like or verbal written response. What's an orienting response?
Something that happens when you look at something.
Yeah, it's something that happens when you attend to something, when it catches your attention. And physiological changes associated with orienting responses. Heart rate deceleration, we turn our head, we look at something, pupil dilation, increased skin conductance. So turning our head, so this is number 3. Also cephalic vasodilation, increased blood flow to the brain, peripheral vasoconstriction, decreased blood flow to the periphery, brain waves, and something like early P3. 4 types of sounds that grab our attention. Things that change in frequency, change in intensity, change in duration, change of location and sound.
That was increased intensity, right?
Any changes in intensity.
Oh.
Increases of intensity don't have to be nearly as obvious to grab our attention.
Okay. So,
Decreases of intensity have to be a lot more rapid for us to pay attention to them.
okay. So it's location, duration.
Location, duration, intensity, and frequency. And
Okay.
changes in any of those will grab our attention. Okay, what's habituation?
Becomes ritual.
Pardon?
It becomes ritual when you're like having repeatedly like
Yeah.
stimulus.
Exactly right. So let's say something keeps happening, we're going to stop paying attention to it. We've habituated to it. It becomes ritual. Dishabituation is when, after we've habituated to something, we allow a period of time to happen and then we become resensitive to it again. So 4 things that affect habituation of sound. The rate of repetition, the faster it is, the more we're going to habituate to it. The more regular it is, the more we'll habituate to it. The less intense of a magnitude it is, the more we'll habituate to it. And then a history of past habituation and spontaneous recovery cycles. How do we learn anything about how infants perceive music when they can't speak?
Orient responses.
Orienting responses, exactly right, yeah. Infants will orient to musical stimuli when they prefer it or when it's novel. In other words, they haven't habituated to it. Okay, what's the relationship between statistical learning, mere exposure, and musical enculturation? Okay, through repeated exposure to music, infants internalize the regularities of their musical experiences in the form of implicit knowledge. We can see what's considered not novel by looking at infants' orienting responses. Sat was the guy who looked at infants preferring lullabies that they heard while in their final weeks in the uterus. So they preferred that after they were born, showing that infants can hear music and appreciate it. Okay, 4 features of lullabies that make them especially suited to infants. They tend to be slow, the average pitch is higher, there are fewer changes of pitch direction and greater proportion of descending intervals, all of which are intended to be soothing.
What was the last one? What were the intervals?
More descending intervals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you say repetition is more common?
I didn't say that, although that does tend to be true, that lullabies do tend to have a large amount of repetition, yeah. Slower average pitch is higher, fewer changes in pitch direction, and greater proportion of descending intervals, that's what I said. Okay, the critical periods of acquisition for speech learning is when?
3 years old.
Yeah, for pretty much from birth to about 3 years old, for native languages. And up until 7 years old is sort of what they call the critical period. For music, it's up until about 12 years old. There was that study that looked at violinists who started before they were 12 had different brain structures than musicians that didn't have, that started after 12. Okay, adolescence is an important time in the formation of musical tastes. What physiological changes might account for the musical importance of adolescence?
Change in hormone levels.
Hormone levels, specifically what neurochemical?
Oxytocin.
Oxytocin, you got it. High levels during adolescence, and so bonding is facilitated. Okay, what social factors might account for the musical importance of adolescence? It's a big time for developing musical taste, the music you listen to when you're an adolescent. So socially, adolescence is an important time to build peer support relations, to supplement family support relations. Adolescence is characterized by a strong need to belong or identify with a peer group. Group identity is established in part by clothing, manners, speech patterns, food, and music preferences. When do secondary emotions start to show up?
3 to 4 years.
3 to 4 years. At what age do children start showing less spontaneous body movement in response to music?
I didn't get this one.
About 5 years old, yeah. It's a sad, sad day. It's fun to watch kids just bouncing spontaneously to music. At what age do children typically show substantial rhythmic coordination? I don't know if we talked about this one in class. About the age of 10. Okay, so what's the order that kids develop the skills for these things? First is localization. They do this pretty much immediately. Then pitch, then tonality, then rhythm, and then style. We just talked about this last time. Why do we nod our heads to music instead of blinking our eyes? The vestibular system, yeah. The activation of the vestibular system is pleasurable for us, and so we like bouncing our heads to music, and we internalize metric pulse when the vestibular system is activated. Okay, and this is answer number 19 as well, the vestibular system. What's the most common tapping rate to music?
100 to 120.
110 to 120 beats per minute, which is about 500 to 550 milliseconds between beats. And this is tied very closely to the movement of the leg, which is like a pendulum, which naturally swings at a period of about once per second. So together your legs hit twice per second, making your head bob at the same rate as a preferred tempo in music, and your head bobs, that activates the vestibular system. Do males like to dance faster or slower than females?
Slower.
Slower. Why?
Because their legs are longer.
Their legs are longer and they weigh more. Yeah, exactly right. Okay, what's the difference between inductive and deductive knowledge?
One is from fact, and the other is, well, one's from observation, and the other one is from theory.
Logical analysis. Deduction is from logical analysis. Induction is observation. Okay, we can talk about introspection and extrospection. What's the difference?
One is looking within you, and one is looking outside of you.
Yeah, so introspection involves mental self-observation and intuition. Extrospection involves looking at the behaviors of others. And if you formally extrospect, it's called?
Empirical observation.
Empirical observation. Yep, good. Okay, we already talked about 4. What's the trade-off between ecological validity and experimental control? talked about this back when we looked at my experiment. You know what ecological validity is?
It
It's-
can be reproduced in the real world.
Yeah, right. So it's how close does the experimental condition reflect what happens in the real world? And the more ecological validity we have, usually the less experimental control we have, and vice versa. So it's always kind of a trade-off. And as you guys are thinking about now, your own experiments, I've had a lot of conversations with you guys already. There's always this trade-off between how realistic do we want to make the experiment versus how many variables do we want to control for and be careful with. And usually you have to kind of make choices about that. All right, 3 minutes to spare. Any questions about anything else from the packet or from the semester that we haven't really talked about yet?
How is the test formatted?
Okay, yep, and so there will be somewhere between 15 and 20 questions. And I think I mentioned this in class once or twice, but the idea is that I will give you a question that will kind of be like a real world problem. So I gave you a couple examples in class. One of them was, you've got a friend who lives in Austin and is trying to make a name for herself in the music world, and she sits in her apartment and creates all of her music on the computer. People love her dance music, but for some reason, when she tries to make expressive, emotionally intense music, people think that it sounds flat. Why? So then you have to think about the question. It's kind of a situation, a puzzle, and you have to figure out, what things we've learned this semester help you answer that. So you might say, well, if it's completely computer generated, it could be that it's metrically super precise, and if it's supposed to be emotionally expressive, then we need to have animacy cues, which involve push and pull and rubato. So I might suggest to her to start adding some of these animacy cues, micro timing deviations, and also dynamic variability that reflects more animate objects. So that might be one question. I think I gave another example. Your uncle has an apartment in Dallas above a bus stop, and every time that the bus waits down below his window starts rattling a lot. Give it a physical or acoustic account of why that might be happening, and suggest one thing he can do to fix the problem. So it could be that the bus is vibrating at the resonant frequency of the window, and one thing you could do is replace the one window with 2 smaller windows which have different resonant frequencies, and then they won't sympathetically vibrate as much. So that's kind of how this is going to work. I'll give you a puzzle like that, and if you can answer all the questions on here, you should be in pretty good shape, where you're able to kind of pull in what you already know to apply it to a situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's not scary, right?
Oh, it sounds really hard.
Does that sound hard?
Application questions are not fun.
Pardon?
Application questions are not fun.
Application, but it always reflects a deeper level of understanding,
Yeah,
right?
that's the hard part.
Yeah.
Deeper level of understanding, yeah.
Making sure you hit all the things.
If you can answer all the questions in the packet, I think you'll be in pretty good shape. Not only I kind of gave you all the answers today, but not only answer them, but sort of understand what it is that they're talking about and how they work. I think you'll be in good shape. All right, so I'm meeting with Alex first, and we could actually start right now. And if you want to come back at Jess, if you want to come back at 3:40 or something, we'll just do it all here. And then Heath, if you want to come back at 4.